Hey, my name's Xander, and today we're talking about one of the most famous Western outlaws, Butch Cassidy. Now, Butch and his gang, the Wild Bunch, were known to have stolen somewhere around $2 to $3 million in today's value. And even though he was this rugged cowboy who stole from people, he was also known as a gentleman, fun-loving outlaw. He wasn't known to have killed anyone while robbing and stuff throughout the United States. If you've ever seen the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, biographers say that even though the events in there are not always accurate, it did get his personality right. Butch Cassidy was known as a fun guy, a prankster guy, kind of this guy with a positive personality. And sometimes I like to dive into this fun stuff about Western outlaws. And this one especially because Butch grew up in the same place I grew up, here in Utah. Not too far from me is the home where he grew up, and not too far from me is one of his most famous robberies. And so it's just kind of neat to see how all of this stuff happened in the canyons I've seen, the deserts I've seen. It's been really neat for me to just kind of read as much as I can about Butch Cassidy and see my world come to life in that way. Anyways, in this video, I want to go over what led Butch Cassidy to turn from a young teenage Latter-day Saint here in Utah who loved to play music and even read books. What turned him to becoming a Western outlaw, living the outlaw life? So let's dig into this history. So Butch Cassidy's real name isn't even Butch Cassidy. He was born Robert Leroy Parker. But in this video, we're just going to use Butch Cassidy just to keep things simple. And he was born here in Utah, but Utah wasn't even a state back then. It was a territory. And Butch's grandparents and parents were immigrants from England who converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and made the trek west across the plains as pioneers to make a life here in Utah. Butch's parents met in a little remote town in the center of Utah territory called Beaver. And they were married and sealed together, a Latter-day Saint tradition. But even though they had their religion, Butch's dad wasn't necessarily devout or active. And he was gone a lot as well. He served in the military, he served in the Black Hawk War. He was a postal carrier, so he rode his horse through remote areas, dangerous areas, possibly dodging Native American attacks. And he worked on ranches and even helped build Fort Cameron here in Utah. Butch's mother, on the other hand, she was very faithful and tried to keep her family close to some Christian values. Butch would have likely grown up with stories about his parents traveling across the plains to get here to Utah. For example, one story is how Butch's grandparents lost their son while traveling west. The son would have been about 5 to 7 years old. This would have been Butch's uncle. The wagon train had to keep going, so Butch's grandfather stayed behind and searched for this boy for several days and found him at a cabin with a guy there. And the boy said that he was alone and that he heard scary barking dogs, which were likely wolves out in the wilderness. Another interesting fact is that Butch's grandfather practiced polygamy or plural marriage, being married to multiple wives. It was a practice back then in Utah by Latter-day Saints. They don't practice it now, but back then, the federal government was cracking down on polygamists and throwing them in jail. And Butch's grandfather would hide from the law. There's one story where the lawman came knocking on his door and he had to jump through the back window and hide in some bushes. So Butch Cassidy would have grown up with stories like this. But things would change dramatically for Butch at about the age of 13 when his dad decided to move him from Beaver over the mountains to a little town called Circleville. So when Butch Cassidy was just 13 years old, his father moved his family to the little town of Circleville, which back then was a pretty rough and rugged place. It had a lot of miners. It was on the border of Native American areas, and there was a lot of cattle rustling happening. Not only that, but Circleville had a lot of dramatic history. For example, it was in the area where the Black Hawk War happened. This was a war between Native Americans and Latter-day Saints, mainly Utes, but a lot of different Native American tribes banded together because the Latter-day Saints were encroaching on their lands, and hundreds of people died. Circleville was also the location of the Circleville Massacre, where some militia had some Paiute prisoners, and the militia panicked because they didn't know if these prisoners were going to attack, and they massacred all these Paiute peoples. These are all stories that I want to cover on this channel and dive deeper into. So if you like, subscribe, or share, you're going to be able to directly help me make these videos and share them with the world. So Butch grew up in a very harsh environment, but it wasn't just the people or the events, but it was also just living and settling in the wilderness. There's stories of how Butch's family lost all their cattle due to a random winter storm, or how they lost all their crops several times. There's stories of how when they first came to the area, they had to live in dugouts and how they lived in small cabins. There's one story how Butch's mother was on a wagon carrying a baby, and something happened and she was thrown out, and her face got peeled off by some of the wheel on the wagon. And the doctor said this was the worst thing he's ever seen. She survived, and they fixed her face as best they could, but she was permanently scarred from it. And by the way, the baby survived. That would have been Butch's brother. But this just shows just kind of how rough and rugged and wild it was out there in the West for this family. And this kind of brings us to our next topic about how Butch would have struggled to find excitement and meaning in this environment. So Butch Cassidy, as a teenager, grew up in the remote little town of Circleville here in Utah, and he would have done things to help pass the time or bring some more excitement into his life. And his sister recorded how Butch would play the harmonica for his family, or how Butch loved his mother so much he'd pick her up and put her in a chair and say, "Here's mom, here's the queen." Butch Cassidy apparently read a lot of books. Apparently he was smart and he had a lot of potential ahead of him. It's probably why a lot of people liked him, because he was pretty sharp. He would capture magpie birds and teach them how to speak. There's accounts where he planted some trees near today's site where they think Butch Cassidy grew up, and you could go visit his childhood home over there. And you could see these Lombard poplar trees that his sister said that Butch planted. And Butch would also pull pranks to kind of pass the time. There's stories where he would take wine from his neighbor and feed it to his chickens, and his siblings and them would have a laugh watching the chickens stumble back and forth. Butch and his siblings would capture Mormon crickets and tie strings to them and race them around. He was just a fun-loving kid who had a knack for just going out and doing things exciting. But sometimes those things went too far. For example, there's a story where Butch was traveling to the city to buy a pair of trousers, and when he got to the store, it was closed. And so for some reason, Butch decided to break into the store and steal a pair of trousers and leave an IOU there, telling him he'd pay the person back. In Butch's mind, he thought this was fine, but the owner of the store didn't think it was fine and got the lawman involved. Now, no charges were actually followed through with, but this probably left a foul taste in Butch's mouth for lawmen and whether the system was actually just and fair. Now, one painful moment in Butch Cassidy's teenage life was when his dad tried to get some extra land. Federal law allowed people to own about 160 acres, but his dad was looking for about an extra 60 acres more. And apparently the bishop of the church ruled against the dad from that land. And this apparently caused some resentment between Butch's dad and the church. Now, we don't know the exact reason why this happened, and that's kind of the problem with studying Butch Cassidy is there's so many different accounts. One account suggests that Butch's mom may have been tricked to signing over this extra land. Second reason, the bishop ruled against the dad because the bishop didn't like it that Butch Cassidy's dad smoked or drank or wasn't active in the church. Third reason could be that the church didn't like it when people owned more land than they needed. They thought 160 acres was enough. Another reason I've heard is that someone else actually owned that extra land and Butch's dad didn't necessarily know that. And so even though he started settling on it, this other person came in and actually said he owned the land. So we don't know exactly why, but we do know that this led to some resentment between Butch's dad and the church. And apparently Butch probably would have known about this as well. Apparently Butch's mom had to do all she could to keep her family within the church. So Butch Cassidy's family struggled and struggled to make a life out here in the Wild West. But they survived and endured like so many other pioneers in Utah during that time. But there's one thing or one person that turned Butch Cassidy from this young, hardworking family boy into the outlaw that we know today. So apparently, to make a bit more money, Butch Cassidy's family took a job just a few miles south from where they lived at Marshall's Ranch. Here the mother would work on the dairy while the boys would help out with the farms. And Butch Cassidy would have been an older teenager back then, almost to adulthood. The owner of Marshall's Ranch was known to be a criminal, and it's likely that they practiced cattle rustling here. Cattle rustling is basically when you steal someone else's livestock. Cattle, sheep, horses was the worst offense, but it was an easy criminal activity to get into. You'd be out in the wilderness, no one around for miles and miles and miles, and you'd see someone else's cattle, and you would justify just taking a couple for yourself and not worrying about it. The problem is, for many people, that would easily cascade into stealing more cattle and then into robbing and stealing from banks and trains in the case of Butch Cassidy. It was kind of like a gateway drug. So Butch moved to this ranch and got introduced more and more to it. But someone came to this ranch that would greatly influence Butch Cassidy's life. And this was Mike Cassidy. Mike Cassidy apparently taught the young Butch how to shoot, how to rope, and maybe even how to steal cattle and rebrand cattle. In Mike, Butch saw someone who was free, who was not tethered to the land, who can pick and go where he chooses. Butch apparently wanted that lifestyle. We think that Butch idolized Mike Cassidy so much because that's where Butch Cassidy gets part of his name from Mike Cassidy. So remember, Butch Cassidy was a fake name. Butch's real name was Robert Leroy Parker. And throughout his criminal career, he would choose fake names. Apparently, he landed on Butch Cassidy. Butch, which apparently came from Butch working at a butcher shop or something. And Cassidy, which came from Mike Cassidy. Just an example of how much Mike Cassidy affected Butch. So Butch Cassidy's mom, seeing these bad influences happening in her boy's life, decided to move him back to Circleville and get away from these problems. But the damage had already been done. And Butch, around the age of 18, late one evening, came to his mom to give her some bad news. He told her that he was leaving. Apparently, he said there was no money in Utah and that he could find a better living elsewhere. She begged him to stay, told him to at least wait until their dad got back the next day. But apparently Butch wouldn't have it. He was out for sure and was hasty about it. The next morning, she packed him some supplies and saw him ride off into the distance, and Butch's parents would never again see him in their lives. There's different accounts to why Butch was so hasty to leaving. One account says that he was leaving to avoid arrest. Another account says that he had some cattle that was stolen that he was supposed to deliver further in the east of Utah. Another account says that he took the blame for some of his friends stealing horses, and because the lawmen were after him, he was leaving for that. Another account says that Butch Cassidy was actually captured by some lawmen, escaped, felt bad that he abandoned these lawmen in the desert, and came back and gave him some water and supplies, good old Butch Cassidy style. Again, so many accounts, we don't know which one's for certain, but whatever the reason was for why he fled so fast, one thing's for sure is that this was a major turning point in his life. It would be the point where he would turn from Robert Leroy Parker, his real name, into the Butch Cassidy that we know today. So just a couple years after Butch Cassidy left his family, never to see him again, he performed one of his most famous robberies in Telluride, Colorado. So what led this young farm boy with such potential to become an outlaw, a criminal? Some people have said that the young Butch had potential to become a senator or a politician or a lawyer. He was that sharp. So what transitioned him in this other direction? There could be a dozen reasons why. Poverty. It was just a hard way of life there in Utah. It could have been resentment to authority figures and lawmen. It could have been bad friends, bad mentors. Mike Cassidy, for example, with Butch's dad gone all the time, Butch probably leaned towards Mike Cassidy's way of life and was greatly influenced by cattle rustling. But I think through all my study of Butch Cassidy, I think it had a lot to do with restlessness. I think Butch just wanted to get out and have fun. The more you read about him and the accounts left behind, you see that he was just this exciting guy who just wanted to pull pranks and do fun things and feel the rush of excitement. And unfortunately, he chose to do it in the wrong way, in an illegal way. And I'm not here to justify him. He did bad things. He hung out with really bad people. But apparently he saw in that way of life excitement. So thanks for watching this video about Butch Cassidy. I hope you enjoyed. There's so many more I want to do. I really want to do a video about his famous robbery not too far from me at the Castle Gate robbery is what it's called, near Price, Utah, and go through the story of how it was planned, performed, and the escape route. If you like and subscribe and share this video and channel, you're going to be able to directly help me make more videos like this. On this channel, I like to mainly focus about Native American history because I'm half Native American. So if you're interested, check out this video right here about the ancient Fremont people that used to live here in Utah before Europeans and white settlers came to the area. Thanks for watching.